Welcome to Tuesday, everyone. You are watching CBC News BC. I am Jessica Chung here in the CBC Vancouver newsroom. Let's get you caught up on your top stories. Now, Vancouver Coastal Health has issued a reminder to parents to check their children's vaccine status. Now, this comes as measles is on the rise globally with outbreaks in Ontario and in Texas. And public health officials in BC say vaccination rates against measles have slipped. Now, the BC Centre for Disease Control says 82% of 2-year-olds have gotten one dose of the vaccine, while 72% of 7-year-olds have gotten both.
It's really sad. It's really tragic. This is a preventable infectious disease. We could not have this disease at all. Measles was eliminated in Canada in 1998 and in the US in 2000. We risk losing that status by having 12 months or more of sustained transmission, and we don't have to.
Vaccination rates have declined due to increased vaccine skepticism. The BC CDC says some families fell behind on vaccines during the pandemic as well. And the lowest vaccination rates in BC are in the Northwest and Kootenay Boundary Health Service delivery areas. And Canada's annual rate of inflation jumped to 2.6% in February as the federal government's 2-month sales tax holiday came to an end mid-month. Now, that's up sharply from a 1.9% increase in January when GST and HST were taken off a variety of goods and restaurant bills for the entire month. Now, StatsCan says without the tax break in place for half the month in February, inflation would have come in at 3%. And Canada's oldest retailer is on the verge of closing for good. Hudson's Bay says it could not secure financing and will start liquidating all of its stores by June 15th as the company grapples with nearly $1 billion worth of debt. Now, according to a document from a court-appointed monitor, that debt is owed to 2,000 creditors, including vendors here in BC, one of which told CBC that his company is owed $15,000.
I was always really proud of the Bay to kind of like be in there and still, it was almost like a monolithic institution. And so it does come, it comes with a heavy heart to see this go down because I expected more.
Now, the retailer hopes to find financing to keep a few stores out of the liquidation, and through it all, 9,000 jobs are in the balance. A Quebec man has finished a grueling cross-Canada bicycle journey in Vancouver. 34-year-old Louis-Joseph Couturier took on the challenge as a tribute to a friend who died while cycling, and also to advocate for cycling infrastructure across the country.
I think we're going to only benefit from more cycling infrastructure. We can benefit from making our citizens move more, address climate change, address local pollution issues. There's so much we can address with cycling infrastructure.
And Couturier's roughly 6,000-kilometer journey actually began back in 2020. He started in Gaspé, Quebec, only to make it to Thunder Bay before the pandemic forced a pause. Now, in January, he finally resumed the trip. He cycled about 100 kilometers per day through the winter. Wow, that's amazing. And that's it for now. I am Jessica Chung. You are watching CBC News BC. Stay here, don't go anywhere, because BC Today is up next.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. You may be looking even more closely at your finances these days. Across Canada, inflation is up, and the country is bracing for the impact of American tariffs. But Ottawa is now in the process of canceling the consumer carbon tax, which could lead to a break for you at the gas pumps. What is your cost of living situation, and are you looking for different help? And in our second half hour, it is a life-saving skill, swimming. But if you're trying to find a space for a child or loved one to learn, good luck. So we're asking, should swimming lessons be something students learn at school? I'm Dan Burritt, in for Michelle Elliott all this week. Welcome to BC Today. Thank you for joining us on radio, TV, and live stream. You can call us now on our top story. What is your cost of living situation? Inflation is up, but the carbon tax is set to be lifted, among other things. Our number is 604-669-3733. You can also call us at 1-800-825-5950 or pound 690 on your cell phone. Please be pulled over or hands-free when you do that. Or we'd love to get an email from you, bctoday@cbc.ca. Canadians are feeling all sorts of cost pressures right now. Today, Statistics Canada announced inflation ticked up sharply last month as the federal government's temporary tax holiday ended on household goods, gifts, and restaurant bills, among other things. We're also bracing for the impact of tariffs imposed by U.S. President Donald Trump and countermeasures launched by Ottawa. Add to that, in BC, a rate hike from BC Hydro. The province says customers can expect an increase this year and next of about $3.75 per month to the average household bill. On the other side of the ledger, Prime Minister Mark Carney has signed a directive to end the consumer carbon tax, and BC's Premier has pledged to do the same. We'd love to hear from you. How are you feeling about your cost of living situation? Will a break on the carbon tax help you? What about that lost rebate, though? Are you looking for some relief? For more on this perspective, we are joined by Moshe Lander, professor of economics at Concordia University in Montreal. Moshe, good to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
What do you make, first of all, of the rise in inflation in February? It's a noticeable uptick.
It's a bit of an illusion too, right? Because we had lower inflation because of the tax holiday in January and in part of December. So this is kind of averaging things out. It's still within the Bank of Canada's comfort range of 1% to 3%. I think we should view any number in that range as being equally beneficial, not just that if it's 2, it's good and anything outside of that is bad. But I think that, of course, maybe worse is to come in the coming months as we haven't seen the impact of all of the tariff talk. That occurred in March, and so those numbers are still yet to show.
We understand that these things could take some time to trickle down, if that's the right word, or flood down, depending. Now, this CPI report comes just a week after the Bank of Canada cut its key interest rate by a quarter point to 2.75% to help manage inflation. That continues those cuts that began last June, if I remember right. The next decision is set for April 16th. What do you think the bank will do now after seeing this jump in inflation?
Well, if you had asked me a week ago, I would have said that I don't think that the Bank of Canada should cut interest rates last week. And that wasn't because I saw that the inflation number was going to come in at 2.6. It was that you want to hold on to those interest rate cuts for when you really need them. Cutting interest rates is giving space for inflation to grow. And I understand that the Bank of Canada has an impossible situation here that on the one hand, if they try and keep interest rates high, that would keep inflation in the bag a little bit. But if there's any economic damage to GDP or unemployment that's going to come out of the tariffs, the high interest rates could make things worse. You cut interest rates like they did last week, then while that might prop up the Canadian economy in terms of GDP or keep unemployment lower from what it otherwise would be, inflation might escape a little bit. I think that in general, the last thing the Canadians want is a return of inflation like we saw in 2022. So I got to think that in April, at least at this point in time, Bank of Canada has got to hold on to interest rates in 5 weeks. They used up one of their arrows in their quiver last week, so best not to burn through what you've got left.
We are talking about the cost of living. How are you feeling? Are you feeling pinched right now? Are you bracing for the impact of higher tariffs? Are you looking forward to paying less at the gas pump if you drive a gas car? Give us a call, 1-800-825-5950, pound 690 on your cell phone. In Metro Vancouver, the number is 604-669-3733. You can email us as well, cbc.ca BC Today at cbc.ca. Amid all these changes, Moshe, we should point out Prime Minister Mark Carney signed a directive to end the consumer carbon tax, keep it on industrial emitters. Federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says he wants the tax lifted on all sectors and people. Here are Carney and Poilievre, one after the other, explaining their positions.
This will make a difference to hard-pressed Canadians, but it is part of a much bigger set of measures that this government is taking to ensure that we fight against climate change, that our companies are competitive, and the country moves forward. So it's my honor, on behalf of my colleagues, to sign this order.
That a common sense, Canada First Conservative government will repeal the entire carbon tax, including the federal backstop that requires provinces impose industrial taxes. There will be no taxes on consumers, no taxes on Canadian industries.
Now, what's not mentioned there are the carbon tax rebates that many Canadians receive, Moshe. If you have the math handy, what were people getting? Were they still up ahead if they were getting a rebate?
At the margin, they were coming out ahead. The Liberal government did a very bad job of selling it to Canadians that even though you're seeing it at places like the gas pump, you were getting that quarterly rebate. And it differed by province. BC was maybe not seeing as much of a benefit as the rest of Canada, but in part that was because there was also a provincial policy in place that wasn't necessarily there in other provinces. I think that when we're done talking about netting all of this out, that your gasoline prices might go down, you're not going to get the rebate, it's probably less than a small Tim Hortons coffee a day that's going to affect the average BC household. So it's not going to be a significant game changer. The important part of the tax was that it was properly pricing carbon and its effects on the economy. By removing it, that proper pricing is no longer in place. So that's going to distort consumer behavior. So I don't even know that it's necessarily as much an issue of are people paying a net positive or net negative amount into the tax. It was what it was trying to accomplish. And we see a difference between Mark Carney, the central banker, and Mark Carney, the prime minister, the way that he flip-flopped on supporting this policy, then backing away from it when he has to face voters.
Now, we also have, I want to play another clip. One of the main goals of the carbon tax was to lower Canada's emissions. It was first introduced in BC in 2008. The early edition Stephen Quinn spoke with UBC political science professor Catherine Harrison about the impact of the tax on our greenhouse gases. Let's have a listen.
And has the consumer carbon tax not worked?
It has worked. In fact, some of our best evidence of that comes from British Columbia because BC adopted its own carbon tax back in 2008, and economists had a heyday doing all kinds of statistical analysis with that data. And a number of studies found that emissions were lower than they would otherwise have been, even with, the carbon price around $30 per ton. But the key thing is with the current schedule to steadily increase the carbon price, that reductions would have grown over time. And it was anticipated that the consumer carbon tax Canada-wide would reduce Canada's emissions in 2030 by 20 million tons per year, below what they would otherwise have been.
Moshe, I see you nodding along there. It may have worked, but is there a substitute to the consumer or industrial carbon tax at this point?
Well, we're going to see it behind the scenes now, right? So where you played the clip of Pierre Poilievre saying that he wants all of the taxes gone, it does imply that there is still a tax that's going to be present. It's funny, I think about to the 1990s when the Mulroney government introduced the GST. There wasn't really an internet to speak of back then. There certainly wasn't social media. I wonder if Mulroney would have been as successful being able to bring in the GST. If you remember, the Chrétien opposition was saying their first act would be to scrap the tax. It kind of sounds familiar to the Conservatives today, looking to axe the tax. And as soon as they got into power, they realized this actually isn't the worst thing to have happened. Not because it generated money for the government, but because it was replacing a hidden tax, the manufacturer's sales tax, that people couldn't see. And transparency is always a good thing. When you drive this tax now behind the scenes and people can't see it, there's still going to be a tax. There's still going to be an attempt to try and correct carbon emissions, but we don't see it anymore. And that's going to make it more difficult for us to make informed decisions about deciding between products that are bad for the environment and good for the environment if on the surface as consumers, we don't see that the the tax is there, even though really it is behind the scenes.
Let's go to Peter in Victoria. Peter's on the line. Thanks for waiting, Peter. What's your cost of living situation?
Tolerable, almost manageable, but I'm a single income family and have been for quite some time as I'm a widower. Up until last week, I was very concerned about the fact that my mortgage is due for renewal at the end of April. And that I was looking at in past months, certainly last year, a $300 to $400 increase in my mortgage payment, which is, I can't cancel that. I can buy less food, I can cancel services, etc. But the mortgage payment is really kind of fixed and immovable. So last week's rate reduction has reduced the likely cost of my mortgage by a couple of $100, which is just enough wiggle room that I think I can kind of make it affordable. So there you go. Just hanging in there, but I'm glad that the rate has come down a little bit so that I'm paying a little less than likely if on a fixed rate, probably a little less than 4%, which is a relief. And
in certain times like this, Peter, we know that it's an old cliche, but every little bit helps. May I ask, how are I understand you have two kids and they're in their 20s?
One turns 20 today, in fact, and the other one is 22, and they're in Montreal because they recognize, Montreal is still affordable.
Did they go there for the cost of living, or did they go there for education? What brought them there?
The adventure. As much as anything, and while they're still welcome to stay here at home, and they were paying rent, taking a gap year, as it were, sure. Recognizing that Montreal is someplace that they could go and still find it affordable.
Mm-hmm. And Peter, lastly, appreciate your time. What do you make of the drop of the consumer carbon tax, but perhaps no more rebate?
Well, I don't recall as a British Columbia resident getting a rebate, and frankly, it was invisible or transparent or opaque, whatever you want to call it. I really didn't see the cost of it, and frankly, don't buy into the hype. It costs what it costs, and everything's getting more expensive, and it's just the nature of the way things go. So,
Peter, thanks very much for your call. We appreciate it, and happy birthday to your loved one, your child there. Let's go to Rob in Kelowna. Rob, what's your situation?
Well, hi. Thanks for taking my call. I'd like a comment from your guest, I think, on two things. Sure. First of all, there is huge confusion in the public between the cost of living and the rate of inflation. I mean, if our rate of inflation is around 2 or 3%, I have a degree in economics, but it's an old one. In any event, the cost of living around 2 to 3%, and I know that in that cost of living calculation, there's a basket of consumer goods. But when we look at the actual increase in our grocery bill, it's probably more like 10 to 15%, as opposed to the 2 to 3% reflecting inflation. And I'd like your guest to explain why that is. And then the second thing I would like to know is what percentage of those basket of goods that calculates the inflation rate at 2 to 3% is, everyday things that people buy, like groceries. Because I suggest that after rent or your mortgage payment or whatever it is, that the highest expense in the family is your grocery bill. So, for example, within the last 6 months, the cost of my blueberries, has gone up probably close to 40, 50%. And I suggest that that's happening all across the broad spectrum of the grocery business. Mm.
Rob, thanks for your call. Moshe, if you don't mind doing a mini lecture for us and answer the fellow economist question.
I love that there are people out there that have economics degrees. It makes it so much easier if society had more people with economics degrees. But even if you don't have an economics degree, like you said, here's the lesson. So the way that we calculate inflation is we take a basket of goods that the typical consumer buys, and all we do is we track it. So imagine that you write down a shopping list of things that you want. These could be goods, they could be services. They're not just groceries. It could include rent, gasoline, clothing, nightlife, and all of those things. And if we find that the average price is going up, that's what we call inflation. So when you and I are talking about 2.6% inflation, that does not mean that every good went up 2.6%. It just means that the average was. So some goods could in fact be going up more than 2.6, some exactly 2.6, some could be going up less than 2.6, and some could outright be going down. And so we saw, for example, in the last month, the gasoline prices did go down. When we take the average, it's not a simple average, which means we don't just take all of these goods, figure out the price change, add them all up and divide. We take a weighted average. And so if housing and groceries are a bigger part of the typical person's budget, then those price changes get a more weighted portion of the calculation for how much inflation there was. So where your caller was saying that he noticed that his blueberries had gone up 50%, if that's part of the basket of goods that the typical consumer buys, it's probably a small portion of it. And so there are a bunch of other things that might be weightier that are helping to keep the number down. The thing with an average is it's an average. And that doesn't mean then that all of us are experiencing inflation in the same way, because within the basket that the typical consumer buys, I can tell you I'm not the typical consumer. Not because I earn more than the average or because I'm more important than the average. It's just merely I don't buy what everybody else buys. I go to the grocery store and I buy the things that I like, and you buy the things that you like. And so your caller might be experiencing higher inflation than average merely on the basis of the things that he buys. Say like blueberries, where maybe I don't buy them in the same degree or at all.
Let's go to Dan in Fort St. John. Dan with a great name. Thanks for joining us. What's your situation?
Well, actually, I was telling your screener there that for my wife and I, we're in our 60s. We've reduced pretty much all of our debt, and we both got a couple of good jobs still, so we're actually doing okay. I feel bad for a lot of younger people that are still trying to get traction, and even people in their 40s that are still trying to get traction in the economy. But Mike, I actually have a question for your guest today as well. I am not a formally trained economist, but I do understand some economic fundamentals. And my question is, in the 80s and the 90s, when I was doing most of my, adult growing up, the Bank of Canada used the interest rate as a lever to either, cool the economy down if it was, if the economy was, overheated, they would raise interest rates to cool off the economy, or they would either lower interest rates to stimulate the economy. Why are we seeing lower interest rates? We're still seeing inflation being very stubborn, and it hasn't stimulated the economy. Are the economic fundamentals out of kilter right now? Are we in stagflation maybe?
Dan, appreciate your call. Thanks very much. A very interesting question. Moshe?
What a great word there, stagflation. That's somebody who has recollections of the 1970s, to throw that phrase out there.
And quickly, Moshe, explain stagflation for us.
Stagflation is just a portmanteau. It's a made-up word that combines stagnation with inflation. So you get stagflation. And so this normally occurs when you have, say, supply chain disruptions like we had during COVID, during natural disasters that hit BC, like forest fires and earthquakes off the coast and things like that, that can cause supply chain disruptions as well. And so what you find then is that getting goods to shelves becomes difficult, and so prices rise. But you don't get as many goods to shelf either, and so you have a little bit of a stagnating economy. That was the major shock of the 1970s when oil prices were jolted. Your caller is right that the Bank of Canada did used to use interest rates as the lever to steer the economy, but beginning with the Chrétien government in the 90s, they cut the Bank of Canada loose and said that your goal from now on is to keep inflation between 1% and 3%. Once you have that under control, if you have it under control, then you can worry about using interest rates to try and steer the economy, propping it up or slowing it down like your caller was suggesting. But first and foremost then is inflation. And so this is like a hierarchy that the Bank of Canada commits itself to. Given that they've kept inflation between 1% and 3%, and they don't see it moving outside of that range for the foreseeable future, that interest rate cut last week was designed to help prop up the economy. But it's important to note, and this is maybe the bit that your caller was missing, is that those interest rate movements take time to work their way through the economy. Just because there was an interest rate cut last week doesn't mean that you and I are racing out to spend more money and draw down our savings. It might take a few months or even a couple of years before we can change our lifestyle decisions to respond to those interest rate cuts. So it is true that it will help prop up the economy. It's just not with the snap of a finger. And that's the missing part then, is when interest rates were going up and we were getting frustrated saying, why isn't inflation coming under control with all of these interest rate increases? It took time, but eventually it did work. Same thing on the downside then. To be able to prop up the economy is going to take a little bit of time. And that's why they've given us 7 in a row, is to try and accelerate that time frame so that we can start to change our behavior, secure that interest rates aren't going to go back up to where they were last year.
Let's squeeze in one more call before the break. Mike is joining us from Vancouver. Mike, what's your situation?
Part of the conversation was about the carbon tax being canceled, and for those of us, me included, who are one on an old age pension with no investments, and two, not paying the carbon tax, that money, which was $255 a month, $255 every 3 months, that's $85 a month, was significant to me. I mean, that $85 a month paid my internet and phone bill at home. So, for someone making $100,000 a year, that's not going to do much. But if you're not paying the carbon tax and you're losing that, you're losing something I'm going to notice.
Mike, we appreciate the call. I just did back of the napkin math. That's $765 for you for the year. Moshe, last thought to you. Where do you see this? My apologies. My apologies, Mike. Yes. Moshe, last word to you on what you expect next.
Yeah, so your caller highlights an interesting conundrum there, that the actual cash that you receive every 3 months is something that's tangible, but the carbon tax that you're paying is not really noticeable when you go to the pump or when you buy something at Tim Hortons that has embedded in it the transportation cost of getting the coffee to the store, and that carbon tax is in there. So by getting rid of it, the thought is that somehow we're going to be worse off because we're not seeing the big headline numbers. I remember having a conversation years ago with Ralph Klein when he wanted to give the $400 Ralph bucks to Albertans. My argument as an economist was it's bad policy. His argument was it's great politics because people get that $400 cash in hand and they don't care where it's being made up or how it's being made up elsewhere if it's incrementally. And so I think that's part of the problem then that I said earlier, which is the Liberals did a terrible job of communicating to Canadians why we need the tax and why, on average, the average person is not really going to see a big change in their bank account.
Moshe Lander, professor of economics at Concordia University in Montreal. We appreciate your time and your expertise. Thanks for joining us.
Anytime.
It is 12:28. This is BC Today. Many of you called and emailed us about the fate of Hudson's Bay yesterday. We're still waiting to find out what a judge decides. Darren in Kimberley wrote us to say Hudson's Bay towed the line for Canada's Olympic team in the 1990s, provided endless warmth with their colorful blankets at campfires across Canada, and was the historical foundation for the fur trade. Long live HBC and Team Canada. Joanne says, I appreciate the Canadians will lose jobs. There are about 9,000 at stake right now. But Hudson's Bay, she says, was instrumental in the colonization and degradation of our Indigenous population in Canada. As well, it is not Canada's company and hasn't been since 2006, instead been American-owned. I find it rather ironic with the current political atmosphere that the company is closing now. I do understand there have been financial difficulties, but it just does add an element of interest. Yannicka says, I still miss the malt shop in the basement. I would always go there for a treat with my mom. And Dee in Maple Ridge writes us to say, we sell out our stores to the U.S., and soon enough they go out of business. He named them all, so why isn't there protection from foreign ownership? Tanya says, in part, in the 1950s, my grandmother lived in a very small town in northern BC, and the lure to leave her town and go work at the Bay was an extremely big deal. It was her first job, and it was revered then. I was born in the 70s, and we went to the Bay for back-to-school shopping, my dad rushing on the very last 2 days of Christmas shopping, so my sister and I would help him get my mom's presents at the perfume and makeup counters. I remember sweets and chocolate counter dearly. My sister and I would pool our money and get bulk chocolate macaroons, very tasty. If they'd kept some semblance of service and staffed it better, I think they would have done a bit better. Good night, Hudson's Bay Company. Thank you very much for the emails, and we have received a lot of them about that, as well as the cost of living and swimming lessons, and that is coming up next. You're listening to BC Today. This is BC Today on CBC. We're on Radio 1, television, and live streaming on our website, cbc.ca/BC, YouTube at CBC Vancouver, and yes, on the CBC News app. Coming up, they can be very hard to find, but invaluable to learn. Swimming lessons. Is it time to make them part of school learning? We'll discuss that and take your calls and emails after this news update with Robert Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. The U.S. and Russia have agreed to pursue a limited ceasefire in Ukraine. The agreement was the result of a call between Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump. Under the proposed deal, Russia and Ukraine will stop hitting each other's energy infrastructure for 30 days. The BC Prosecution Service says no charges will be laid against a Vancouver police officer involved in a fatal shooting 3 years ago. The service says police had received a 911 call from the single-room occupancy hotel about a resident who had allegedly assaulted others with a stick, then picked up a knife, and one of the officers shot the man after he refused to drop the weapon. The prosecution service says it has concluded the evidence does not meet its charge assessment standard. And Canada's inflation rate jumped to 2.6% last month, up from 1.9% in January. Analysts say the end of the federal government's 2-month GST holiday was a key factor. And now the BC forecast on the north coast. Showers this afternoon with strong winds and a high of 6. Highs around 2 with a mix of sun and cloud in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George, some sun and cloud with a high of 3. Highs reaching 7 degrees with some sunshine in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, including Kelowna, some sun and cloud with a high of 8. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria, and the Fraser Valley, increasing cloudiness this afternoon. There's a slight chance of showers with highs up to 8. That's your CBC News update from Vancouver.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zimmerman, and thank you for joining us on CBC Radio 1, CBC Television, and live streaming on the CBC News app, cbc.ca/BC, and of course on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. We have lots more on the day's top stories coming up this afternoon in your region. In Metro Vancouver, here's what's coming up on the coast.
Hi there, Dan. It's Gloria Makarenko here, and I hope you can join me for On the Coast this afternoon. We're going to check in on the measles. I mean, when was the last time you had a booster? We'll tell you how to find out if you are still up to date. Also, Elbows Up is the name of a brand new podcast that was released last week. It's going to examine how Canadians can stand strong in the face of an annexation threat. Laura Palmer is the producer. She is going to join us to talk about that, so I hope you can join us this afternoon between 3 and 6.
Gloria Makarenko, thank you very much. And you can hear On the Coast on CBC Radio 1 and Metro Vancouver and anywhere on the CBC News app. Happy spring break, everyone. Yes, it is that time of year. And if you have young ones in your family or your life, swimming is not just a popular activity, but learning how to swim is considered a mandatory life skill by many people. But finding a swimming lesson for a child can be a huge challenge, especially in Metro Vancouver, among other places. As the CBC's Pinky Wong explains, the scarcity means private operators are now diving in.
This is the deep part. So this
a pool
is where
dedicated for swimming classes.
The founder of the company says she saw an opportunity to serve communities that want swimming classes desperately.
We hear from our customers a lot that it's really, really hard to get into the public pools.
She says a dedicated pool can focus simply on teaching.
So they have to do swim teams, they have to do lifesaving, they have to do public swims. And so our goal with this pool and with our other pools is just to have an instructional pool.
At the Port Coquitlam Community Centre, the pool is a hot place to be.
You do like swimming, right? We go to the pool. You almost need to like set your alarm and be up early for when registration opens because it's very busy.
I can't really get into any of the weekend ones. That's tough.
The registration rate for classes is at 97%, according to the Director of Recreation.
Right now, I have about 132 kids waiting on a wait list. We do everything we can to increase our lessons by adding more lessons based on staff availability.
He says more than 1,000 children were on the wait list last year.
As we head into the warmer months, swimming classes are getting more popular. One Metro Vancouver City has decided to teach some students swimming and water safety skills through their school curriculum.
It's a life skill that everyone needs.
In Burnaby, City Councillor Daniel Tétrault has been advocating for free swimming classes for students. Around 60 grade 5 students are currently learning swimming under the pilot project funded by the city.
It's recognizing how vital and important it is to teach this life skill to all students, and that it's an equity issue, and that funding it will ultimately save lives.
He says the city has approved spending to expand the program to 500 students next year. This parent has been taking her 2 children to private swimming classes for around $50 per lesson.
I think there should be a lot more swimming lessons and probably should be more affordable as well for other families. We just pay a lot more just because they can learn faster.
Councillor Tétrault says he's hoping to get federal funding so all Burnaby students have access to free swim classes. Pinky Wong, CBC News, Burnaby.
We're asking you now, should swimming lessons be part of BC's school curriculum? And are you able to enroll your children in swimming lessons? Give us a call, 1-800-825-5950. Our number in Metro Vancouver, 604-669-3733, pound 690 on your cell phone. Please be pulled over or hands-free if you're driving. And you can email us, and some of you already have, bctoday@cbc.ca. And joining us today is Kimiko Hirakida. She's the Director of Programs and Services at the Lifesaving Society B.C. and Yukon branch. Thank you for coming in today.
Appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
So you were looking at that story that our colleague Pinky Wong did. You've already seen some of your literature in there. What's the process like, either at this time of year or just overall, about how busy it gets and the demand for swimming lessons?
You know what? This isn't something that's just localized to Metro Vancouver. This is occurring all over British Columbia, all over the Yukon Territory, and all over Canada, that we are finding, and we value our swimming lessons and teaching those water smart attitudes. And there is quite a few wait lists all over the country to get into swimming lessons.
Across the country?
Yeah.
Is one region a longer wait than others?
Obviously, the major cities are always a huge wait. There's more population and more demand for swimming lessons, but we do also see it in some of the small, more rural communities where they have smaller pool structures and maybe less instructors that are available. So we do see it in all areas.
Do you have a typical wait list of that, or at least the calls or emails that you get about, hey, I'd like to get my child in, and what do you say to people?
I see it all the time, and unfortunately, you have to kind of look at where you could go broadly with swimming lessons. And, Pinky talked about that there are some private companies that are popping up to offer swimming lessons. This isn't a bad thing. We have many private affiliates that are affiliated with the Lifesaving Society, and they've recognized a gap in our society where we need more swimming lesson spaces. And we're seeing some creative new affiliates come on board to teach swimming lessons in backyard pools.
Of course, and that's one solution. Keeping in mind that running a pool is incredibly expensive for cities, governments, all that kind of thing. So there is a cost involved, isn't there?
Absolutely. And we are seeing quite a few of our pools within BC that are aging and coming to the end of their natural life cycle of being a usable building. And it's something that we all need to keep in mind.
Well, the Vancouver Aquatic Centre downtown is just the latest example of a facility that's supposed to be renewed, but there are already concerns about how long the pool may be. Some of us may have grown up with the standard, the Red Cross swimming lessons that was offered in schools for years, we understand. When did that go away?
I can answer this.
Okay.
So the Red Cross, being a humanitarian organization, they recognize the opioid crisis as well as climate change, as well as the pandemic as being where they should focus. And they also recognize that the Lifesaving Society of Canada offered many life-saving programs and as well as offered a swim program. We were very fortunate to launch the Swim for Life program in BC and Yukon a few years ago now, and we have 98% of the pools in BC and Yukon that use our swimming lesson program. So it's really wonderful to see that they build a progression into our lifeguarding courses.
Let's go to the calls. They're already coming in. Joe's in Prince George. Joe, what do you make of the demand for swimming lessons, getting kids and even adults in?
Well, they should be coming back. When I was in school back in the 70s, we'd go swimming once a week. We got our badges. We had our lessons. We got our badges. When we first started, we had an outdoor pool in the summertime, and when the fall came, we'd go to an indoor pool. So I think they should be bringing them back.
Yeah, and I understand you got the badges, and that was through the Red Cross course?
I'm not sure. Like that was like 60 years ago.
Joe, I have to ask you, when you look back on it, how valuable was that for you?
It was very valuable because we do a lot of fishing and everything. So when you're out in the boat, maybe something happens, you want to know how to swim. Even with a life jacket on, you want to know how to at least paddle water, keep your head above water.
Joe, we appreciate the call. Thanks very much. And Kimiko, I saw you nodding along there with, back when they were in schools.
I couldn't agree with you more, Joe. I also was part of swimming lessons in grade 3. I attended and did my badges that way. And it's really not necessarily like the Red Cross swim lessons versus Lifesaving Society lessons. It's what the Ministry of Education puts into the curriculum. And we also very much wish that it would be mandatory in the school programs for grade 3. That's what we've identified as being a great age for all swimming lessons to kind of happen in the school.
And why grade 3?
It's the target age that we really want to get to, where people may have not had the opportunity to get into swimming lessons, but they're still at a developmental stage where they can progress and go further. And if it was in the school system and they were doing lessons during the school day, it would actually take away from some of those wait lists where people are able to get into lessons during school hours, and they might not need to be on a wait list for like a Saturday lesson set, for example. So we strongly encourage school boards to look at having it mandatory.
Making it part of the week. Interesting. Karen joins us from Victoria. Karen, what do you make of the call on the demand for swimming lessons?
Well, I work in an elementary school, and I have seen it implemented in grade 3 in the past. But here in Victoria, we have a unique problem in that we are going to be pool starved because as a regular swimmer at Crystal Pool, they have to rebuild that, but it's going to be closing in about in a year and a bit for 3 to 5 years. The McKinnon UVic pool has been closed, and the Y downtown, all within a few Ks of each other. The Y will be closing as well. So I'm really concerned about this. I'm really disappointed that our councillors didn't come up with another venue other than the Crystal site, because it's important to keep those trees and that park. I thought S.J. Willis, for anybody who knows the area locally, might have been another place where they could have thought of instead of making us pool starved for another 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, Karen, I have to ask you, what do you make of the fact that had to go to a referendum rather than City Council deciding that just upgrading a pool was an important thing to do?
Well, we had, this was initiated, I think, about 7 years ago, something like that. And then there was a lot of outcry because of the loss of trees, the loss of a central park, which is really important to the North Park neighborhood, so I understand that. And I think what this was is just frustration on many people's part, because the Crystal it's had its day. It's going to be tough on getting parts and things like this. So I think that was a way of asking people for their engagement. There was 2 questions. One is, should we build a pool? That won by 60%. And then the other question was, where should we build it? On the current site or the one just off to the side, which would have taken away the central park for the North Park neighborhoods and would have downed a lot of trees. They didn't look or propose a totally different site, which I'm really hoping we have some counselors listening now and might think about an alternative site, which would be, say, S.J. Willis, which is right downtown, right near Save on Foods Arena and Topaz Park.
All right. Karen, appreciate the call. Thanks very much, and good to remind people about the situation with Crystal Pool. Kimiko, one of the things we're running into, and we alluded to it earlier, is cost. Running these things is hugely expensive. So do you have to make the argument and balance off saying this is an essential life skill, even though we know learning it can be pricey?
Again, we look at the drowning prevention, and drowning is the leading cause of accidental death for children that are aged 1 through 5. It's also, we have to look at them as a recreation center. So we have to look at our long-term health goals as well. We see our lineups in hospitals and to find a doctor. And as our population grows, we need to look at increasing the infrastructure around there and understanding that recreation centers play a vital role in everybody's mental and physical health as well, and should be included in new plans for growing communities.
Brent is joining us on the line from Beasley. Is that right, Brent?
That's correct. Beasley Tip.
Wonderful. What do you make of the call to get more kids and people in general into swimming lessons?
Well, as a person who probably, I think, around 7 or 8 was drowning and would have had I not been rescued by a bystander on the beach. And by the time I was 10, we had moved to an area where we had access to a swimming pool through the school. And so from 10, by the time I was 14, I was a bronze medallion swimmer.
Oh, wow.
I went on to becoming a lifeguard and a swimming instructor. But I cannot stress enough the importance of teaching children to swim. And when I was teaching, we did the basics, the 5 and the 6-year-olds, teaching them to float. And that's so critical, and not be afraid of the water.
Brent, if I can ask, what was it like working with those young kids?
It was very, what's the word? It's
fulfilling?
Satisfying, I guess, it was so wonderful to see them go from being afraid of the water to having them holding on to the edge of the pool and putting their face in the water and blowing bubbles. And that's what we told the parents. Take your child home, fill the bathroom sink full of water and have them blow bubbles in it. When they're having a bath, have them put their face in and blow bubbles. And that's the start.
Brent, thank you so much for doing that. And hey, good on you for teaching so many kids to swim. Kimiko, I saw you having a little moment there.
I love that phone call. Thank you so much, Brent.
Let's go to Katie in Squamish. Katie, you have a background in swimming instruction, we understand.
Yeah, I do. I used to teach years ago, and I feel that swimming is something that is vital for anyone, like whether you have intentions of going into competitive swimming or master swimming, or whether you just want to learn so that you can be safe at the beach. It's just it's a life skill that needs to be, the importance of it needs to be brought forward more. And it's we teach kids, when I was in high school, we did soccer, we did ice fishing, we did hockey, cross-country skiing, everything except for swimming, and we were taught all these different sports, but not swimming. And the question for me is, why are we teaching everything else and not swimming? And of course, other sports have important life lessons to learn as well, but swimming lessons literally saves lives. And for parents who want to take their kids to the beach, in Squamish, go to Alice Lake or something, for them to have that, to know that their kid would be okay playing at the water's edge, and if they toppled over into ankle-deep water, that their kid would be okay to get out. To have that for a parent to know is a game changer for them, and they can relax and enjoy their time more as well. Not saying they don't have to supervise, but it just takes a lot of pressure off the parent as well.
Yeah. And Katie, you're in a community that is fast growing and feeling the effects of more people moving to Squamish. What would you say to the local leadership around how important it is to either have the facilities or the space to teach more people how to swim?
That is, I feel the space and the facility is not just a problem in Squamish, but it's a problem everywhere. There's not enough pools. There's not enough space. The pool in Squamish is even closed from 4 to 7 just so that they can have enough room to teach. Or sorry, it's closed to the public from 4 to 7, just so that they have the space to teach lessons because our pool is so small. And so it's just, if we could get the schools to start offering swimming lessons, we could employ lifeguard swimming instructors more during the daytime hours to get the pressure off of like those huge wait lists and everything, and it would get things moving and it would get things safer, and it's got a lot of positives no matter where you look.
Katie, we appreciate your call. Thank you very much. And Kimiko, I saw you nodding along there with some of what Katie had to say. What do you think?
Yeah, the pool in Squamish is actually currently closed, which is really, really sad to think that the next closest pool in Whistler is also quite a small pool. The staff in Squamish are fantastic at that recreation center, and we hope for its reopening to provide a vital service to the community.
Let's go to Katrina in Kamloops. Katrina, I understand you have some young ones and you're trying to enroll them in swimming lessons.
Hi, Dan, that's for sure. Boy, and is it ever impossible here in Kamloops? We have about 90% of us as parents struggle, and we have to commiserate with each other how we cannot get our children into swimming lessons. But also, I mean, when it comes to the school curriculum, the things that I would especially love to see, though, is, as your other callers said, like this, just pool, like water safety. It's so vital. It's so important. And we get none of that here. You know, and as your last caller said, we're here in Kamloops for the tournament capital of Canada. We get all of these arenas. They're still popping up. We get arena after arena after arena. But none of us can get our kids into any sort of waters activities, any sort of lessons whatsoever. And we have about over probably 100, 200 lakes within the distance here of Kamloops. And that's where everybody spends their weekends. To have some sort of curriculum like brought into the BC curriculum that outlines water safety. You know, we have 2 rivers that run through the city here. What happens when you fall in the water? What do you do? What happens if you fall off the dock? What do you do? We have nothing that teaches these kids, and we have no ability to put our kids into any sort of lessons. I mean, parents, of course, we're responsible and we take on that responsibility. Sure. But if I live lakefront. If I were to invite my kids to my house and now we're playing on the dock or we're playing out, or somebody's come up for the weekend, you have so many kids that have no idea what happens when they're standing too close to the end of the dock. You know, you have so many parents there that need this reassurance that their kids have had some sort of lessons on what to do when. And we don't get any of that, unfortunately.
Katrina, I appreciate your call. You can hear the frustration in your voice. And Kimiko, I saw you're relating to this somehow, yeah?
Yeah, I really feel for you, Katrina. And we read stories every year about drowning rescues that occur on the Thompson River out of Kamloops. And you're right. You're absolutely right. It is a life skill. It's important to teach children. And I think by having that included in a curriculum, we would be able to at least address the water safety and how you could survive or perhaps perform a rescue.
Kimiko, clarify for us, and forgive me for not asking this before, why is it no longer in the school curriculum? What happened?
I don't actually have an answer for that, and I really wish that I did. I think it was just maybe one of those things that through a series of cuts was one of those things that was deemed acceptable to cut. But again, like many of our callers today, I was part of those grade 3 lessons and they were invaluable to me. I still very much remember being a part of that and feeling that sense of accomplishment in a school day.
We have many emails coming in. Miss Van Buchanan from Victoria says, what year is this? I lived and worked in Lethbridge until I moved to BC in '78. I was a certified Red Cross water safety instructor and a certified national lifeguard. Every child in grade 4 schools, public and private, received swimming lessons. Bussed from their school, received water safety talks and those Red Cross swimming lessons. Why does BC have to reinvent the wheel? Interesting question. We appreciate that. Let's go to Frank back in Victoria. Frank, what do you make of the call for making swimming lessons part of the school curriculum?
Yeah, I think it's a must. It should be when I'm 65. So when I was a kid, I took swimming lessons. And I remember even in the summertime going to Sudbury, to visit there, some friends for the summer. My parents were adamant to get me to keep those swimming lessons going. And this is back east. And here I think it should be mandatory since we live on an island. We're surrounded by water. We've talked about earthquakes, tsunami happens, And what I like about my swimming lessons, too, we were really taught to relax in the water, not to panic and so on. And to this day, when I'm in the water, I lie on my back and I relax. I have a membership at the Grand Pacific Hotel downtown, which, there's a nice pool there, so on. And it's not that busy in at lunchtime, or late morning. I don't know why we can't sort of maybe approach some of the hotels and say, can we rent this pool for an hour? Because we got kids. I mean, there's more than one hotel. Whether the business in the hotel industry is going to be hurting this year, I don't know. But it's a good way to maybe approach those pools and say, can we rent that pool for an hour? And who doesn't want a bunch of 8-year-old kids coming to the hotel? Anyways, they're great at that age, And I'm a school bus driver for the school district one, and I think there's one of my fellow workers that takes Tillicum schools every Tuesday and Thursdays. Take them up to the Tillicum Recreation Center for swim. So,
Frank, I appreciate the call. I'm so sorry to jump on. We're going to try and get one more call in, but that's an interesting idea, calling out hotels in BC. If you have a pool, would you rent it out for swimming lessons? Justin in Nanaimo, we have about 30 seconds. Go ahead, Justin.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
I wanted to get into this conversation here about, what's wrong with the parents teaching their kids? Do they not know how to swim as well? I remember being a kid and my parents taking me to the lake, to the rivers, everything like that, and teaching me how to swim, holding me, teaching me how to put my head underwater like your previous caller was talking, and doing that throughout the years and teaching me how to become a really good swimmer. I'm just wondering, why are these parents not enjoying to teach their kids how to swim? Why would they even want somebody else to teach their kids how to swim, right? That's good quality time.
Justin, we appreciate the
child, right?
I've got to jump in, Justin. I'm going to put that to Kimiko. Is it because some parents don't know?
Absolutely. There are a lot of parents that aren't necessarily comfortable or have the background knowledge and want to leave it to the experts at the Lifesaving Society. We do offer adult programs as well to teach Learn to Swim programs.
All right. Kimiko Hirakida, we appreciate your time and your expertise from the Lifesaving Society BC branch and Yukon branch. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you again for having me.
And that is it for our show today. Thank you for calling in and joining the discussion. You can always email us, bctoday@cbc.ca.